Hello and welcome to the What is Justice Roundtable Discussion. If you're joining us in the live audience, please turn off other programs on your screen for a better audio and visual experience. I'm Sosamma Samuel-Burnett, and I'm founder and president of Global Justice, and we are pleased to present today the What is Justice Roundtable video conference. We present this conference so that we have a cross-generational, cross-sectoral dialogue on this very significant issue of biblical justice, and we're so glad that you're here with us today. I'll be serving as moderator, and I'd like to introduce our panelists today. We'll start with Tom Carroll. Tom Carroll is our global commentator on international security. He is also a Middle East specialist and former CIA. We are pleased to have you with us today, Tom. We also want to be here. We also want to introduce Brad Hughes. Brad is one of our Global Justice directors, as well as a fellow at the Centennial Institute. Welcome, Brad.
Thank you.
Drew Gilliland. Drew is with us from the Heritage Christian Academy, where he teaches global studies. So good morning to you all. Well, our conversation starts with our panelists, but for all of our audience members, you can participate by typing in your questions in the box, and we'll be glad to respond during the broadcast or after the broadcast. So, Tom, you have a really interesting background. You have served in the CIA, you've been in communications, you've been a Middle East specialist. From all of those vantage points, tell me why biblical justice matters to you.
Well, I think the way I look at it, it's not particularly profound and not particularly original. Biblical in this context kind of functions as an adjective, as a modifier. Human beings, going back to Aristotle, going back to Plato, human beings have an intellect, right and wrong, good and bad, justice and injustice. That's built into nature. That's built into the system. And we can see it and we can understand it. We can appreciate it. And we can make decisions based on it. But what the biblical side does, it adds just a little bit. It adds the perspective of Revelation. It adds the perspective of the Bible, obviously. And it adds the perspective of church tradition. So it's something more to keep in mind and to take account of when we think about justice. That's the way I look at it.
Great. And Drew, you are a teacher. You're instilling this concept in younger generations. Given your experience, what does biblical justice mean to you?
Yeah, I teach at a Christian school, so we are trying to integrate a biblical worldview into all of what we do. And so I think that justice exists from the beginning. God created justice in the beginning, but it didn't really have to exist until sin came into the world. And so, in my opinion, justice has to do with restoring dignity and God's plan for humans. And so that includes justice towards sin. It includes justice for people who are oppressed, so that they can become good, both spiritually and physically, so that they can come into right standing with God. And so, justice is something that, as Christians, we ought to focus on, because God is both just and merciful, and so you can't have them like separate. You have to have them together. So we often think mercy and justice as separate, but there's really two sides of the same coin.
Definitely, and that's something we want to encourage people to understand, is that integration of those concepts, which doesn't always exist in other views of justice. Brad, you are not only a director here for Global Justice, but you also have this wealth of business experience and experience with worldview and economics topics. Tell us from that experience what biblical justice means to you.
Well, biblical justice to me really just is a reflection of God's righteousness. So when I look at justice in the Bible, it's mentioned 115 times in the Old Testament. In almost every instance, it's a reflection of righteousness. That's what it means. And what is righteousness? Righteousness is just right action based on right thinking. Who has perfect action and perfect thinking? Well, that's God himself. So we see God's justice in this world as he imposes rewards for those that do good, punishment for those that do bad. We see it in the afterlife, where hell has degrees of punishment, and heaven has degrees of reward. And what concerns me in my travels, international, is that we're seeing a conflation of the word justice and grace, where people are now demanding justice when in fact they're demanding grace, and they're not allowing God's sovereign hand to address issues the way he wants. And we just add this, that this is confirmed by recent Barna data, where we're now seeing moral confusion within Christianity in America. And specifically what I mean by that is now, according to this data, 2/3 of Christians now believe that Jesus is a sinner. 2/3 of Christians now believe that the Bible is not correct. 2/3 of Christians now believe that good works gets them to heaven, and more than 2/3 do not believe that Satan is real. So as a result, this is an indictment on the moral confusion, not only in America but within the Christian church. And as a result, that's why we get a lot of confusion about what is justice. So I know we'll talk more about it. Specifically, what I'm troubled by, having done work in Russia, as well as extensive work here in America, is we have a problem with this increasing social justice, which is not biblical.
That might be a good segue for us into another question, which is, there are all these different references to justice in our society, and different forms of justice. So, how would you distinguish between them? So maybe we'll start with you, Drew. How would you distinguish biblical justice from, let's say, social justice that Brad mentioned, or other forms of justice, distributive justice or restorative justice or other forms?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think biblical justice is an all-encompassing term for all of those things. And of course, so within social justice, restorative justice, there are parts of that may not be biblical. But there also are parts that can be biblical within those things. So restorative justice, I think, for example, is a very biblical topic, because we see in the Old Testament, it talks about, it's not just punishing, a lot of times, it's not just punishing someone, it's having them repay what they did wrong to somebody else. If they stole a cow or something like that, they have to repay that debt. So that's one thing. But then we also see that, with justice towards foreigners, for example, or justice for the oppressed, that's also very biblical. And so some people might define that as social justice, of justice for the oppressed, people who are being put down by the powerful. And so we see over and over again that God has a concern for the powerless, to raise them up into a position where they have human dignity and their human, their worth as people made in the image of God is recognized. And so while there's different types of justice, I think biblical justice can be, it has bits and pieces of all of them, and is an umbrella term over all of them. So you can have some specific, but we all have to integrate biblical concepts into those other forms of justice.
Now, Brad, would you agree with that concept that biblical justice is a broader concept, or do you have a different way of distinguishing it?
Well, I understand Drew's point, but I would make this distinction, and that is social justice was first termed by a Jesuit priest named Tabarelli back in the 1840s, right around the time of Karl Marx writing the Communist Manifesto in 1848. And a big part of the impetus behind that social justice movement was redistribution of income. And obviously, Marx presents a significant antipathy towards Christianity. Marx was devoted to overturning Christianity. And if you read Richard Wurmbrand, who started Voices of the Martyrs, a great ministry focused on the persecution of Christians, Wurmbrand wrote a book called Marx and Satan, and the significant influence that Satan had on Karl Marx. And ultimately, Marx wanted to destroy Christianity through distribution. He's the one that said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. But what Marx and that social justice movement that came out of the 19th century, that really exploded also in the 20th century in communist countries and so forth, is rooted in a violation of the Ten Commandments. And specifically what I'm talking about there is the 8th and 10th commandment. So there's a huge impetus today where thou shalt covet. Like, there's this great Occupy Wall Street movement. They're against the 1% because they covet. And the second commandment they love to break is the eighth commandment, thou shalt not steal. And they love to steal. And so the social justice movement, as it relates specifically to the redistribution of income, concentrates itself a lot on the abolition of private property, which I think is completely unbiblical because it's written.
Tom, what is your perspective? How do you distinguish biblical justice? We've had, two, I think, very solid ways to describe that, but how would you distinguish it?
I think the point that was made about the broad function of the idea of biblical justice. Justice, put simply, I think justice is treatment in accordance with desert. To be just is to treat others in the way that they deserve to be treated. Distributive justice, commutative justice, these are all, they're different ways of looking at it. Social justice, in my view, all different ways of different aspects of justice. Now, justice has to do, built into the idea, it has to do with sort of the ends, human ends, telos. What Aristotle would call the final cause, what the scholastics referred to as the final cause, what we're here for, what our purpose is, what our true nature is. Mm-hmm. And there's a natural part of that anyone, any normally functioning human being can see, recognize, and understand. But there's also, added to that, there's the aspect of revelation. Right? And that's where church tradition in the Bible comes into play. So I think that the way I look at it, biblical justice is just that extra illumination with respect to what human beings are ultimately for, what our ultimate purpose is, what the final cause is, our telos. And that ultimately is the beatific vision. It's unity with God. And that overall sort of framework, if you will, is very important because that helps inform how people should be treated and what they ultimately deserve.
Certainly. At Global, we are trying to encourage not only the understanding of biblical justice, but the application of biblical justice. So maybe I'll start with you, Brad. When you think about the range of issues in our world today, what's an example of a key issue that you think where biblical justice really should apply?
Well, again, my orientation is on the Bible and economics, and I would say there's a big issue going on right now in America and across the world with respect to socialism. We now see the number one candidate on the Democratic Party as the socialist, and Bernie Sanders is now ahead of Hillary Clinton for that nomination. And we see this very significant effort around the world to advance the cause of socialism. We see France just elected a socialist president named Hollande. Canada is moving towards the left, significantly towards this, with Trudeau's son or grandson. And this is a significant problem because socialism is a complete historical debacle. It's a failure. But I just saw data this past week that now says 43% of millennials now favor socialism. And the Bible does not teach socialism. It's clear that the Pilgrims tried it, it failed. And so I see this as a really big issue. We've got to come down to what does the Bible say. Jesus said you will always have the poor with you. Jesus said that if a man does not work, he will not eat. And if Matthew 20, in the parable of the vineyard, you find that the vineyard owner pays different people differently. And at the end of the day, he says, it's my money. Can't I pay what I want?
Tom, similarly, you've worked in lots of regions of the world. You've seen a lot of issues, security issues and otherwise. What would you consider a key issue of the day that really would apply for biblical justice?
I think right now it's persecution of Christians around the world. I think that's something that Christians and the ideas of biblical justice, I think those are areas that require immediate attention and immediate application. Not simply the destruction of ancient Christian communities, the ancient Christian church in the Middle East, which is where Christianity came from. Not simply, although I think primarily the destruction of Christians in the Middle East, but also the destruction and death of so many Muslims because of the actions of the radicals. And if there is ever a case of injustice that needs to be righted, it is that. It's what we're seeing across the Middle East and North Africa today. I would put that as issue number one.
Absolutely. It strikes me that, when we don't have religious freedom, and in various forms, we really don't have a lot of other rights and freedoms that come from that. And so it is this extreme ends of the spectrum that are really making it very difficult for us to be able to exercise those rights. So I think it's definitely a big concern. Drew, you again are probably, I guess I could define you as a millennial, right? And you also are working with this next generation. And so when you think about all these issues of the day and issues that you're interested in, your students are interested in, what would be a key one where biblical justice applies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. There's so many, because I work with a lot of kids who I would say are not concerned with justice. They're concerned with their own security and, white middle-class American concern, which a lot of times don't have to do with justice. But I think on a large scale, I listened to a Christian scientist, not the denomination, but like a scientist that's a Christian, and she works at Texas A&M as a climatologist. And interestingly, I think climate change is one of the biggest issues we have facing us today. And here's why: it's because you have all these islands, particularly in the Pacific, and they face complete annihilation. Where do those people go? The sea levels are rising. Their islands are disappearing. Where do they go? And there's entire coastlines that could. I saw an estimate of up to $500 million in the next, 75 years. We could lose $500 million, not $500 billion, sorry, $500 billion of real estate in value. And it affects food production. It affects water rights. We're seeing it in the Southwest. I'm from Colorado, so you guys are from California as well. So you guys have experiencing drought. What do we do with water rights? That has implications for wars and stuff, because people they need water and they need food, and when they lack those things, it can trigger all sorts of other wars, which triggers other injustices like trafficking and rape and murder and hatred and between other people. So climate change on a large scale it causes all sorts of other issues to come up. And so a lot of people look at that, and I'm still learning a lot about it. But I think that's an intriguing issue to consider going forward.
Yeah, I know. Brad, you look like you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to add one more. If there's one big issue that none of us mentioned, but I think it's a huge biblical justice issue, if I may.
Sure.
And that is the state of the unborn. And America is aborting about 1 million babies every year. And I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. It's 1 million babies a year, and we have a very significant policy problem in America where we favor the killing of the unborn as opposed to adoption. If you look at the economics of these two, that the abortion is about 1/10 the cost of the adoption, and is done, in a matter of hours. And you can do it next week, where adoptions can take up to a year and a half. And right now, 90% of all Down syndrome babies are aborted because American parents don't want to deal with an imperfect child. Yet the list for adoptive parents who want Down syndrome babies is extraordinary. It's like 36-1. So we have, such a huge. There's 100,000 adoptions every year, 100,000, but there's 1 million abortions. And we do not pursue biblical justice here in our own nation to provide the financial and tax incentives to accommodate the moral reality that adoption is a reasonable alternative to preserve life. And ultimately, our Constitution has that as our number one protection, to preserve life. And in the Bible, it's clear through the commandments and what God says that all people are made in God's image, and we should do everything we can biblically to preserve life.
It's interesting. In all the topics that you all mentioned, one of the things that we have to wrestle with is that there are competing interests. So, for example, when we're talking about religious freedom and protecting not only Christians but other faiths, we also have to deal with the religious extremism and sometimes even the result of that, which is, terrorism, that kind of thing. And then when we talk about environmental issues, really whether it's climate change or anything else, and on some level, it would make sense that things that deal with the environment would relate back to biblical principles because God made everything, right? And yet we have tensions between other types of interests that compete with that principle. And then when you talk about the right to life, you're absolutely right. We need to protect the unborn, but at the same time, there are those that will say that there's these competing interests about women's rights and that type of thing as well. So how do we wrestle with that sort of competing interests? Anything you'd like to share about that, Tom?
Yes, and actually, if to sort of go with that, I'd like to go back to a couple of things that both Brad and Drew said. I agree, largely with much of what both said. I really liked a lot of the things Drew is coming out with, climate change, things like that. I want to make a comment on some of Brad's points. I certainly agree with the spirit of what he said, but I'm dating myself here a little bit now. My formative years was back during the Cold War, going against the Soviet Union. When we think of Marx and socialism like that, that was horrible. That was despotic, that was destructive, and that is largely gone now. We won the war, and the world is very different because of it. The remnants of it in places like communist China, sadly, the Marxist values and ideology still reigns, but Western capitalists and American capitalists seem to have no problem whatsoever dealing with the communist Chinese. When we talk about socialism today, and I am not a socialist, although I am very sympathetic toward a lot of the things that Bernie Sanders says. I'm not a socialist, but there's also we have to recognize the very strong Christian traditions that involve socialism. There was Christian socialism in England. That tradition. There is in the United States, Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement. There's much of what Dorothy Day said that people today would consider, socialist. So I think, personally, it's important to make distinctions between Marxism, Leninism, what we saw in the Soviet Union, and what we, thank God, defeated, and other aspects that I think are much more reasonable and much more plausible. That's my view.
Certainly, Brad.
Can I respond to that? I would take the other side of that, and I would say that Christian socialism is an oxymoron, and I would go to the Bible, specifically in Acts 5, to look at the example at the beginning of the church, where any time that you see this concern about the welfare of others, it's volitional. And the difference with socialism, when it's done through mankind of the state, it's compulsory. And this is the very significant difference between loving your neighbor and being forced to contribute to something you don't want. So I think Christian socialism is an oxymoron. It is not biblical. Acts 5 is an example that it was completely volitional. The funds were not collected by the state. It was by the church, and it was completely cooperative. So the Christian socialist examples that we've seen, even now in parts of Europe and Greece and so forth, is that the state is the intermediary that is going to impose this, and this is not biblical at all. Again, go back to Matthew 20. I've got a paper on the site where I list about 50 different scriptures that completely repudiate the idea that there's Christian socialism.
I think a lot of those points are well taken. I would only point out that modern capitalism is every bit as much a creature of the state as socialism. Every bit as much, particularly a creature of the courts.
Well, here's where I disagree, and that is capitalism only succeeds through the service of others. Socialism does not. Socialism is serving the needs of the state. So you can't be a successful capitalist, even if you're privately a socialist, unless you're serving somebody else. And that gets expressed through the abundance and reward that you derive in the marketplace.
I think you both make some excellent points. I think the challenge is, rectifying between, sort of the philosophical of these issues versus the application or practical of these issues. But I also want to give Drew an opportunity to weigh in on this. Drew, it was referenced earlier that many millennials are adopting sort of a socialist mentality, even if they don't necessarily understand the elements of socialism. What do you think about that? What do you think about that influence in terms of justice and understanding that in your generation?
Millennials laughed at people who call President Obama a socialist, because socialism, by definition, is it's controlling of the means of production by the state. And so, while Obamacare is kind of a pseudo-socialist kind of thing, it's not controlling the means of production. All it's doing is that you have to buy health insurance. So Bernie Sanders would also, his healthcare proposals are kind of pseudo-socialist. You have to buy into the system. You have to pay a tax. And so then the government would run the insurance, basically. I don't know how that would work with hospitals and all that stuff, but I don't find that he's saying you should, the state should control the means of production. I don't see that anywhere. Mm-hmm. And so, while I disagree with him on a core level, because it's clear if you study Austrian economics, socialism doesn't work. The state does not have the capacity to control the means of production in any meaningful sense, because the market is so complex.
Now that we have a few minutes left of our time together, and I know there's much to discuss on this topic, I do want to give each of you a moment, just your last moments in our conversation today, that you want to share on the topic of biblical justice. If there's one thing you want to make sure that our audience understands about this concept, what would you share? Let me start with you, Brad.
Well, start with the Bible. And the Bible is the reflection of a holy, sovereign, perfect God. And so I would encourage people not to come up with systems designed by men, Karl Marx and others. I would ask them to go to the Bible and examine what the Bible precepts are, because the Bible is our authority as Christians. And if you do that, I would encourage people to look at the paper that I have on the site right now, where I examine some of this biblical source information comprehensively. So I would really encourage people to elevate the Bible as the authority and not man or the state.
Great. And briefly also, Drew, what would you want to say on this topic to our audience as a closing?
Yeah. I didn't finish what I was going to say before. I don't know if I got cut off or something. But all I was going to say is I appreciate how Bernie Sanders, he sees value in the poor and people who work hard but are not able to get ahead. That's all I was going to say. And so I don't think that's socialism on his part, even though he calls himself a socialist. So what I value about biblical justice is that I thought Tom had a really good point. It's treating others as God would have them be treated. It's treating others, it's as yourself. It's the golden rule. So biblical justice is something we've taught to kids since, even if it's not, saying, oh, Jesus said, treat your neighbor as yourself. We teach that to kindergartners in the public schools. And I think that's at its core, that's what biblical justice is. Treat others as you would want to be treated. And that takes a creative act of love that steps out of yourself and puts yourself in somebody else's shoes and sees from their eyes and from their perspective. And then you're able to truly love that person and act justly towards them.
Great. Thank you, Drew. And now, Tom, I'll give you the last word on this because we're almost out of time. But if you had something that you wanted to share as a final thought to our audience on this idea of biblical justice, what would you want to share?
I want to say I agree with both Brad and Drew. Drew, when you decide to run for public office, you've got my vote. I think it is important for Christians to always, and it's kind of springboarding a little bit off of what Brad said, be very cognizant of the great Christian tradition that we inherit. Going back to biblical times, the church through the millennia has thought deep and hard about these issues, and the church has much to teach us from Augustine through Aquinas up until the present day. That's wonderful resources that I believe we don't use like we should.
Great. Thank you each for taking the time this morning for this important and significant conversation. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope you'll return next month for our next What is Justice Roundtable discussion. Thank you. God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you.